Welcome to Casa Navarro's very first webinar. My name is Georgia Ruiz Davis, and I'm the site manager at Casa Navarro. As many of you know, Casa Navarro is the 1850s home of Jose Antonio Navarro. You can go to our website to see more information about him and about our site, and that is at www.visitcasanavarro.com. And a few things before we start with our special guest. In case you did not already know, Casa Navarro will close temporarily as of August 1st, 2020. We're having to seal up the site because of the demolition of a very large building that's been next door to us since the early 1960s. We're happy to see it go, but it's going to be really messy around here for a while. So rest assured that we're taking all precautions to secure the site and to protect it from any damage that could occur. So our guest tonight is Art Martinez de Vara. He is a historian, author, and attorney. He's the winner of the 2016 TSGS Grand Prize Book Award for Dios y Tejas, Essays on the History of Von Ormy, Texas, and the 2014 Presidio La Bahia Award for the Jose Francisco Ruiz Papers, Report on the Indian Tribes of Texas in 1828. He earned his Master of Arts in History from Sam Houston State University and a Doctor of Law and Master of Arts in Systematic Theology from St. Mary's University. He operates Alamo Press and a joint project with Northwest Vista College, publishing multidisciplinary titles focused on Texas. He was an adjunct faculty at Our Lady of the Lake University and served as a mayor of Von Ormy, Texas from 2008 to 2015. And of course, the reason he's here with us this evening is because he has just published a great and very readable biography of Jose Francisco Ruiz, Jose Antonio Navarro's uncle and mentor, and an important figure in the history of Texas. Welcome, Art, and I'm going to let you take over our presentation here. Okay, here we go.
Great. Let me share this first.
Okay. Can you see her? Okay, good.
Okay, there we are.
Awesome. Great. So did you want to say a few words first, or we can start with the questions?
Well, sure. First, thank you for inviting me to this webinar.
Sure.
Casa Navarro is a fantastic location. I've been there many times myself, and obviously, having studied Francisco Ruiz for so long, kind of feel like you're at least a mini Navarro expert. Yeah. So it's close to my heart. So thank you very much for inviting me today.
Sure, thank you. So, Art, one of my first questions that I wanted to ask you is, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, to a certain sense, I think it was in my genes. As a child growing up, I heard many stories about Francisco Ruiz. Again, my mother's family was from Von Ormy, and the Ruiz family and the Herrera family. Ruiz's two children kind of settled that area, and or the founding families there. And so I always grew up hearing stories about him that I didn't find in the school textbooks, and I was a big history buff myself, and so I think I wrote about him in my 7th grade history class. And when I finally got to my master's level and I needed a thesis, it just seemed like a logical choice. I'd also been elected mayor of Von Ormy, and I thought, hey, here's a great opportunity to write a biography of the founder of the city. And what had always surprised me was the lack of such a thing, a lack of a biography. I mean, there are biographical sources, but they tend to be very narrowly focused on his experience in the revolution and signing the Declaration of Independence. So he came a little bit close to heart, and it seemed topical, and it ended up being a much larger project than I ever anticipated.
Awesome. And we're the lucky recipients of that, I think. So let me ask you this: how do you think that your experience as a practicing attorney affect the way you research and write a book of history?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, for one, I could tell you my editors hate legal style writing. That was one of my biggest critiques of my first editor was, it sounds like a lawyer wrote it. And I said, well, you did. They're very different styles of writing. In law school, they pound it into your head to be very precise. And so there's a whole lot of repetition in legal writing because you're trying to be concise and very specific. Of course, in narrative writing, it's the exact opposite. You're going to bore everyone to death with the exact phrasing of everything. But what I found particularly interesting was the fact that Francisco Ruiz was the city attorney. He was a practicing attorney. He helped draft constitutions, statutes, and all of that. I share a small experience with, and so I think I was able to dive a little bit deeper into that, and specifically getting into the Spanish and Mexican legal systems and how that colonial jurisprudence differs from today. I found very fascinating, but it really has an impact on somebody who gets trained in that profession. And again, Ruiz as a young man was tutored by Angel Navarro and others to be an attorney and a potential future alcalde. It seemed to be his career track at the time. And so you kind of really have to understand those processes and those theories of jurisprudence. And you see that reflected in everything he does. He never seems to get away from, as a practitioner. I know it's a classic example where he's in the book where he's sent out to Fort Tenochtitlan out in the wilderness to found a new military fort, and he gets stuck trying a case against his quartermaster for fraud. And so here he is, dealing with frontier issues and provisioning troops, and at the same time having to take depositions and juggling that case. And so it's a fundamental aspect of him. And so I think it was a good fit that an author also be an attorney, maybe understand some of that lifestyle.
Something that you mentioned to me when we did a practice yesterday of this, and you said something about the actual definition of an alcalde, which I think a lot of people think means mayor, right? But it's not.
Correct. Yeah. So alcalde is typically translated as mayor, but actually the etymology of the word comes from the Arabic al-Qadi, which is the Sharia law judge in Islamic Spain. And when through the process of the Reconquista, the Spanish kind of adopted that political structure, and they Hispanicized it to the word alcalde. And so the day-to-day job of the alcalde was actually a judge, we call it the judge of first impression, or the first judge you get dragged before when you commit a crime or you have a civil case. But they also presided over the town council, which is where you get the false analogy of a mayor.
Okay.
But again, the reason why they're not completely analogous is the Spanish system was juridic in nature. So you have a hierarchy of courts, starting with the municipality, then the audiencia, which is like the Court of Appeals, and then at the highest level is the Cortes in Spain, which literally means courts. And the king is seen as the supreme judge of the realm, whose job is to make sure that equidad or equity is present. So equidad is the guiding principle of Spanish jurisprudence, which is a very different system than a civil law system like you see in France, where it's very statute driven. I mean, equidad is just equity, what is fair. And so yes, there's statutes, and yes, there's court precedents and procedure, but ultimately you can appeal to the court for equity, saying, hey, this isn't fair. And so yeah, so the alcalde, and to be an alcalde, you have to have prior service on the town council. And again, Ruiz's kind of pathway that he was leading was first being an assistant to the city attorney, or the procurador is the term, the Spanish term. and then serving in other legal capacities.
Right.
And again, he appeared to be on that career track of ultimately being an alcalde or a judge. But the 1810 revolution, Hidalgo's revolution, kind of came in and disrupted not only his life, but everybody in Texas and
Right.
Spain. So,
Right. Okay, wonderful. So let me ask you this. Your book provides a very illuminating historiography of Ruiz. Can you talk about how he's been viewed by previous generations of historians and how your book is different?
certainly, yeah. So, I do have I wanted to present the historiography of Ruiz, which, for those who don't know, historiography is kind of the history of the history. What has come before. Primarily, to kind of lay the groundwork for future historians who are going to come in and hopefully improve upon what I've done. Mm-hmm. But it seems very limited in scope. I mean, I guess within a decade after he passed, he appears in Berlandier's accounts of his travels in Texas. And there, he's presented as an expert on native peoples and as a guide, and there's a lot of personal stories because the two spent a lot of time in the wilderness together on hunting expeditions, and right. I suppose they shared a lot of stories. But following that, he begins to make his appearance in American histories primarily as an anomaly, as the quote unquote Mexican who sided with the Texian cause, and which you see is a few initial works who there's a big challenge in that, like, how is that so? How can someone who is ostensibly Mexican, a retired Mexican military officer, side with the Anglo-Americans in this uprising? And generally speaking, they subscribe just the American or Anglo tradition or experience, and they project it onto him. And he's cast up there with the other revolutionaries and signers of the Declaration is mythologized a little bit, but it tends to focus merely on that, and that he was rebelling against tyranny and kind of oversimplified. Then you just see the same sources repeated over and over and over again. And so rarely, not until even the Whitty Museum did a short, like a little 10-page booklet on him in the 1930s, I believe, when his house was moved to the side of the Whitty, which for the first time kind of expounds upon his background in the 1810 to 21 revolution, Mexican independence. But by and large, he was kind of caricatured and had a very simplistic presentation. And unfortunately, you see that on some of his the historical markers and other public monuments to him. So, but obviously, again, it come the 1990s and 2000s, we really started getting an academic reevaluation of Tejano biography, and kind of looking at it from the perspective or the Tejano perspective and their background. And you can generally speaking from his generation, and this would include Antonio de Vara, the Texas Revolution was not their first walk in the park, if you will, with political uprisings or revolutions. And so a lot of what happened in 1813, during the Battle of Medina, I think Gutierrez McGee expedition and its aftermath had a very big impact on the generation that lived through the 1836 revolution, and particularly in Béxar or San Antonio, right. Because of the harshness of what happened and the price that was paid. So I think in my biography, that's what I try to do. I tried to set a backdrop of not only the Tejano experience, but what would have been their cultural and political worldview. So we kind of dive a little bit into Spanish liberalism and Catholic philosophies, political philosophies of the time, and kind of try to show where Ruiz fell within that spectrum and that political culture tradition. Right. And I think you do that, you get a much better perspective of how he found common cause with his Anglo neighbors, and not necessarily espoused their same perspective and their same background.
Mhm. You mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned liberalism, and I wanted you to, if you could, define liberalism as it was used back then. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. The words conservative and liberal are
Right.
very pregnant with meaning, especially I guess we're in an election year as well.
Right.
And so I guess the first thing you would advise folks is that those terms are repeated throughout various contexts, and so they're very contextual. So what's a liberal in 1810 Texas is very different than what's a liberal in 1920 America or contemporary Texas. So liberals, generally speaking, are trying to reform or change society, and so you have to look at the status quo to define what type of reforms that the liberals are taking. And so for Ruiz and his generation of Mexican liberals, they are coming from a established a monarchy, one in where the Roman Catholic Church is the established religion, where ideas of individualism and democracy haven't taken hold. What kind of upsets everything, what kind of stirs the pot, if you will, are two things. One is the Napoleonic invasion of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, which causes political upheaval in Spain, and the Jesuit Enlightenment, which occurs probably 30 to 40 years before that, and it spreads throughout Latin America. And the Jesuits and others were big proponents of neo-scholasticism, the school of thought, which basically allowed for Enlightenment thinking within the construct and context of still a Catholic worldview. And so, they taught people to challenge grand narratives without challenging specific institutions. And so a lot of folks are trained, in scientific method. They're trained in theological discourses, again, of a broad nature, that they then began applying on a personal level to the political situation. And some of the classic grievances we hear from Latin American history are the status, for example, of the Criollos, the American-born Spaniards who do not have the same political rights as the Peninsular-born Spaniards. And then, obviously, going down the racial matrix, Spain was very much a hierarchical society. And then those types of situations began to be questioned. And so you see folks like Francisco Ruiz, who he started his political career, and as a royalist, he joins the royalist cause. The first time he's commissioned or takes up arms is in defense of the Spanish monarchy. But he undergoes a political transformation by reading these Spanish liberal tracts by the polemics and writings of Gutierrez de Lara and others that are sent in illegally or smuggled into San Antonio or Béxar. And he's described by his contemporaries as the biggest liberal of his age. So we know that he again had a radical political transformation. And
that was about 1812, right?
Right, about 1812, as he's serving in the Spanish in the Royalist Army. He's the quartermaster for the Spanish military, and he begins an illicit correspondence with Gutierrez de Lara across enemy lines. And he writes about this in his pension application many years later, and he specifically requests that the time he served in the Spanish Army not be given credit for it, because he was fighting against the Patriots of Mexican Army. Doing my research, it's that in itself is a fantastic nugget. I mean, it's a self-declared or a self-declaration of his illicit correspondence and essentially working as a double or as a spy, if you will, for the revolution within the Royalist Army once he converts. But then, going through the state archives, I uncovered a document which I believe was misfiled. It was in the right file, but essentially it is one of these correspondences, and it's Menchaca, who was Gutierrez's second in command, Ruiz writing to Menchaca, and in it he even says, "I'm writing hastily at night," but they're discussing, how for the revolutionaries to take over San Antonio without causing destruction and loss of life. And Ruiz gets philosophical about it, and he talks about how he'll always defend his nation, or his patria, which contextually you can clearly understand it means Texas. And so finding that was amazing, to actually get a copy of an illicit correspondence that he referred to in his pension application. So we get a sense of what that was. So he becomes a staunch liberal, but again, it's a liberal within the context of his age. So you see, not soon thereafter, the first Republic of Texas, the one that Gutierrez declares, and Ruiz takes his oath of affiliation to it, and some of its precepts are still an established Catholic Church being an established religion, and the prohibition of the introduction of Freemasonry and Protestantism. And so he's still religiously conservative, though on a political sense, he is trying to restructure the order of things. And so, the Spanish liberals also have a very interesting, there is a conservative tradition as well within the Spanish thought. In that, you see within the divine right of kings, you see that very strong in the French monarchy. But the Spanish Jesuits and the Salamanca school, which is from the University of Salamanca, developed alternative theories that kind of parallel some of the Northern European Protestants, in the sense that they espouse that all governments are secular; they're not divine. And the basic premise they provide is that the church is the only institution established by God or through divine intervention, and therefore, by definition, the state must be secular. And kind of based upon those political foundations, they project in that that individuals have law writing ability ingrained in natural law, and that the monarch therefore thus serves for the benefit of the people. And so when the monarch is vacant or absent, or goes against the will of the people have the right to take back control. And in their theory, that control was in the form of a junta, or a council. And so you see in this age of revolution, councils being formed. And Ruiz himself served on at least 3 councils. And if you want to consider the Republic of Texas, his participation in the Independence Convention, you could add to that as well. But within his framework, that was a very natural thing to do. Mm-hmm. So in the context of the 1812 uprising, Napoleon had disposed of the Spanish monarch and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain. And so the Americans view that as an illegitimate government. And so under their political theory, they had the right, therefore, to reform their government how they saw fit. And that was kind of, anyway, so it's kind of the basis of the Spanish liberal political condition, viewpoint. And that would have come up again as well in 1836, when we see the centralists suspend the Federalist Constitution, and in essence, and dissolve Congress and elect what they viewed as a sham Congress. Again, here we have an illegitimate government, and therefore Ruiz would have fallen back on his political traditions of, therefore, we have the right to organize a junta or a convention to instill a new government. So I know that was a very long answer to your question, but again,
no, that's fine.
I devote a lot of time in the book to it, so that I think people can really understand his decisions, his actions, and,
sure.
and what's the underlying political philosophy of the revolutionary activity.
Sure. And let me take just a little. You want to plug your book real quick? And we know we saw the slide, but go ahead and say they're available.
Yeah, the book is Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz. It's available online in many locations. If you would like a signed copy by myself, you can go to alamopress.com. All the books there, those are all my books, but if you order Tejano Patriot from Alamo Press, we will send you a signed copy. It's also available on Amazon and legacyoftexas.com and Barnes & Noble and other places.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. And I want to remind people that if they have questions, that there should be a place on your screen where you can submit questions. Yes, and yeah, so just feel free to ask. You can ask them now, and we'll try to answer them before the end of the program. So, okay. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, well, there are lots of things I want to ask you, but we talked a little bit before, you and I, when we did the practice, about the complexity. You told me about the complexity of writing, in writing about Tejano lives as they relate to the Anglo culture, kind of, that the people that were entering Texas, and why it's kind of more well, yeah, it's kind of it's different and it's more complex, I guess. And can you talk about, you touch on that a little bit, or what that entails?
Yeah, certainly. You know, I've been asked, you know, in different, contexts, you know, why is Tejano biography behind Anglo biography in Texas history? And obviously there are cultural aspects from the last century and a half that focus more on Anglo experience or Anglo persons. But frankly, it's a lot more difficult for your typical grad student. The records are in Spanish. They're in an archaic form of Spanish. The orthography, the shapes of the letters are different. Abbreviations are a very big challenge for many folks. And so, you know, Francisco Ruiz, for example, is in most of his career, he's either in political or military office. And so the language that's used in correspondence is very flowery. It's very highly abbreviated, and they're often writing in haste. So, you know, sometimes the best copy you have is a kind of a dark, dingy microfilm. And so I think a lot of folks, when they make this decision, okay, how am I going to spend the next few years of my life writing my dissertation? It's a lot easier to write an English, you know, with an English-based body of records than a Spanish one. You know, and then there also hasn't been there's also hasn't yet been collections of records that have been done on some of the other main characters. If you want to write about Sam Houston or Lamar, you know, there are the Sam Houston papers, there's the Lamar papers. His records have already been collected and indexed, and you can really start diving into some of the secondary you know, historical aspects that you're trying to write about. When you try to tackle a Tejano figure, you often have to handle the primary source evidence. You've got to get it transcribed. You've got to get it translated, often for the first time, or you're following someone else's tracks, but they haven't been laid out as well. And so it's a lot more challenging to even get to the point where you can just start writing or understanding the documentation. And so that's one of the things I've been trying to do, is preserve my pathway, just so that other folks can come back in and again advance their understanding versus having to backtrack and review a lot of this. Also, the records are often scattered. I mean, you know, there is a large number of Ruiz records in the Bear archives, but they're in the Nacogdoches archives, they're in the Saltillo archives. They're everywhere, and so there is no central place where you can go and say, hey, I'm gonna have the majority of his correspondence or records related to him in one location.
Louisiana, didn't you say you found some in Louisiana as well? Right? Did you find some? Yeah.
Time in exile in Louisiana, and again, that's kind of one of the least documented eras of his life. So I was like, well, we should go there and just at least see the place. And you know, I was able to track down the actual location of the Tejano rebel, of the exile camp. You know, it's referred to in the Spanish records as Bayou Pierre, but it's not the same place as Bayou Pierre, the settlement that you see on maps.
Okay.
It was actually Ruiz's brother's ranch he was granted, and there is a congressional subcommittee that met in Louisiana after it was annexed by the United States to reissue land titles. And Ruiz, though he's in exile, sends folks to go and testify as to the location of his where he's at and their activity on there. And so we have this great congressional record of where the Tejano exile camp was. And based upon that, I was able to go to the county clerk's office, and we were able to track it down through the land titles, which are some in French that they're trying to write Spanish names in French. I think it's really murky, but we were able to locate it. It's now a pine forest, like a lumber lease. So it's still very rural and isolated, just like it was back then. And then
that's kind of nice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
To be able to find that. And again, we know that that's where they camped, and we know from the various sumarias, which are the court cases against Ruiz and the other rebels, what they're doing there. And basically, that's where they begin their illicit trade camp or base. So it would be interesting if at some point, archaeologists get out there and maybe find more about what folks were doing while in exile. The other thing that we were able to find is we went over again on a hunch to the Natchitoches County Courthouse and just describing his life and what he was doing at the time to the local librarian there. She said, well, we do have some financial warehouse records, and we went through them, and we were able to locate his warehouse accounts in Natchitoches where he stored his trade goods. Again, Ruiz and the other rebels were basically armed smugglers and doing illicit trading with the Comanche and the Lipan Apache and running a proxy war against the Spanish, even though they had been defeated at Medina. And so here we have the records of where they're storing their goods, and it was fun to see. You even had his credit score in there. Ruiz had a good credit score.
That's good. Good for him.
And we were able to trace from there his supplier, which is Jose Casiano, who at the time is in New Orleans. And again, maybe about a dozen years later, moves to San Antonio, and again, he's another prominent figure in early San Antonio history. And we see multiple generations of business activity between the Ruiz and the Casiano family. The Ruiz home itself became Casiano Grocers, I think, up until the 19 teens and such. And so, but there's the origin of that connection there when they're in exile. And so. So you got to dig deep and dig hard to find Tejano, early Tejano records, but they're out there and they're still in archives, and they need to be collected. And as more people tackle these subjects, hopefully we'll get a bigger body of documents for other folks to go and further study.
You've touched on so many things that I want to talk about. That I want to ask you about. But one of them that I have neglected to ask you about so far is his relationship with Jose Antonio Navarro. I mean, he was Navarro's uncle, his mother's brother. He was his Navarro's mother's brother. But can you expound on that a little bit, just for case
it was obviously a very, very special relationship, and they write about that in their lifetimes. Navarro, he always refers to him as my venerable uncle. And I think if you look at early in life, they both share a common experience of having their fathers die when they're very young. Navarro's mother, who's Ruiz's sister, was married before he was even born. And Angel Navarro, San Antonio's father, was much older than her. And so we see, that they're, uncle and nephew, but they're like more like 13, 14 years apart in age. So we see that when Ruiz's father dies, his mother moves in with the Navarros. Navarros are Ruiz's sister and mother become the matriarchs of the family, very much so. Throughout all these experiences, the Battle of Medina, the decimation of San Antonio after that, the two families cling to one another, and in their worst of times and in their best of times. And so they're uncle and nephew, but there's very much a adopted father, adopted son dynamic. There's a fellows in exile, they went into exile together dynamic.
Okay.
And it appears from the records too that Jose Francisco was Antonio's first teacher. Again, when Jose Francisco Ruiz becomes the first public schoolmaster, Navarro was in his class. And so there's so many different connections and dynamics that you can find among the two. But yes, they were connected at the hip in many ways. And then you look at this extended family, it also goes over to Juan Garamendi. And so you've got, Ruiz as a military, one of the things I present is how being compadres, they're all compadres of one another,
Yes.
and close, in-laws, that they formed this extended family with Garamendi as the political head, and the Navarros as the commercial, and Ruiz as the military, though they all participate in all three aspects at various times. And again, it's a very difficult life they live through. They live through periods of revolution and survival, and so they're very close to one another. But it begins, I think, in their childhood and sharing that common experience and sharing the matriarchs of the family, helping guide them through their lives and all of that.
Yeah. There was definitely a special bond between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like a what do I want to call it? A little thing. We had a visitor this weekend who asked me about, he was doing like a historical marker kind of tour of San Antonio, and we were talking about Ruiz, and he said, well, so many people believe, and even the historical markers dedicated to Ruiz say that he was educated in Spain. But did you find any evidence that Ruiz went to Spain to receive education?
No, I did not. That is glaringly absent in all of the records and all of the experiences, all of his correspondence. I devote a few pages in the book to trying to dispel the myth, of a Spanish education. And frankly, I think it comes from, it's kind of a legacy of the late 19th century where racial attitudes being what they are, a lot of folks a lot of Tejanos attempt to, or their biographers attempt to Europeanize them to explain their exceptionalism. Mexicans were seen at the time as being ignorant and defective morally, and a lot of these racial stereotypes that are used to demonize them and to explain this context of the Texas Revolution. And so, Navarro has the great explaining away of having a Corsican ancestry, so therefore he's European.
Right.
Corsica being the home of Napoleon and all that kind of stuff. So you see a lot of that enter into his narrative. At Ruiz, you see this out of the blue appear, this Spanish education or Spanish or Europeanization. But the Ruiz family was impoverished after his father passed away. His mother had to live in the presidio quarters of his brother. I mean, they didn't have 2 nickels. I mean, compared to other folks though who were, they were, they did have a home and that type of thing, but they were not in any way afford to send someone to Spain for an education.
Right.
The years where he's absent from the records, where he could have gone to Spain to be educated, was the height of the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. And we know that Britain had naval embargoes on all the ports, and so it would have been a very, it would have been sending someone into the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and so that didn't seem practical. And then Ruiz himself argues against. So when he's on the city council, they're given the Spanish Cortes, the liberal Spanish Cortes, opens up for American representation. So every province, every Spanish colonial province is allowed to elect or appoint a representative to go serve in the Cortes. And so Ruiz argues that there's no one in Texas, no native-born Texan, who has the education to serve in that capacity.
Yeah.
Nor do they have the resources. The city, the whole province doesn't have the resources to even send anybody, even if they found somebody who was educated. So that seems to argue against it. And then, his daughter who writes recollections of him in his later days, often says that he would talk about the wilderness and revolution and those types of things, but no one ever mentions that he mentions an experience in Spain. So again, I think it's a fabrication of the late 19th century to kind of elevate him above
Okay.
other Mexican figures who the authors are trying to demonize.
Okay. Thank you. How do you think, well, no, I know you know, but how was Ruiz able to develop good relations with Native Americans in this region? And I know you have like the whole, I mean, there's a whole book dedicated to his writings, his journals.
Yes.
Yes. That you edited.
Yeah. I think part of it is a matter of his birth. I mean, he's born in San Antonio, which is a frontier capital, and
Okay.
so physical security and frontier encounters with Native Americans is an everyday presence. The family ranch out on the Medina gets abandoned several times because of Comanche raids, and so again, it's an ever-present experience. We see also that there's a practice in San Antonio of adopting indigenous youth. They phrase it as adopting. Other people might characterize it as slavery or forced labor or bringing in domestic. But at any rate, we know that we see indigenous children being baptized by his father and brought into the household who would have served in the domestic capacity. And part of it is necessity. When he goes into exile, he's got a price on his head. He's in the neutral strip, so there's this unique area in the world where there's no government. He can't step foot in Louisiana, show his face, or got a price on his head. He can't step foot in Texas or anywhere.
Right.
The Spanish authorities have control, and so he goes to this third option, which is indigenous Americans, and so he lives among the Comanche. We know for approximately 13 years. He goes to war with them. He trades with the Apache, with the Arapaho, and these are all documented in his own writings and in Berlandier, who writes about his accounts and becomes a known expert. He speaks Cherokee. We know that from his experience as commander in Nacogdoches, and he speaks the indigenous sign languages, which is how folks communicated who don't speak that. So, he's very unique in his generation in that his writings about Native peoples comes from that perspective. I mean, a lot of writing, you read Spanish colonial records, and they divide the indigenous world into two spheres, right? The Indios Barbaros, the barbarian Indians who need to be eradicated and exterminated and controlled, and the gente de razón, the people of reason who get missionized and Christianized, and they try to integrate into Spanish society. Ruiz, when he writes, and he's clearly living among the Indios Barbaros, as his contemporaries would have characterized. But when he writes about them, he doesn't demonize. He writes about Comanche eschatology, their view of the afterlife, their warrior fraternities, their ethics, and of course, he writes from someone who has deep knowledge of that society, and so. That became very useful as other folks moved into Texas. He's appointed as Indian commissioners from, again, the Mexican government, from the Spanish government, the Republic of Texas. When he serves in the Texas Senate, he's naturally selected for the Committee on Indian Affairs. And we even see Sam Houston deferred the Republic Indian negotiators to Ruiz. And even though he's retired at that point, he said, "Hey, run everything about Ruiz before we take action." And so, I think it started early in life, but you can't replace that experience of living 13 years within an indigenous society, which is how he got his connections, which became powerful, his political connections within the indigenous world, but also his perspective on their culture and their philosophy and their religion.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're gonna go to questions. I have a few questions that people have been asking, so we are going to go to that. Your book explores why the elites of Béxar, such as Ruiz and Jose Antonio Navarro, came to support independence, while other Tejanos elsewhere rejected it. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, yeah. So the other Tejanos were not Tejanos were not uniformly in agreement.
Right.
What's your
That's true.
take on that?
Certainly. And I would go even further and say the majority of Tejanos were in opposition to independence.
Okay.
Even when you see these published lists of Tejano participants, nearly all of them participate prior to independence. And we see a lot of folks are not willing to go that far. They view that as treason. I think one, and I don't want to repeat a lot of it, but a lot of it is the Spanish liberal tradition that really took root in the Ruiz and Navarro families, and so they're on the very far left of the spectrum of Spanish political thought as well to begin with. And two is their experience in the last major uprising. So when they rose up in 1812, 1813, they were defeated. Ruiz led the army off the field at the Battle of Medina, and Joaquin de Arredondo goes into San Antonio, a very traditional Spanish military officer. They all view themselves as Romans, and so they implemented the old Roman punishment of decimation. They rounded everybody up, they drew lots, they executed people on a daily basis, they confiscated property. I mean, right. Texas got to the point where the governor at one point recommended abandoning the province. It was that desolate.
Wow.
And so they had paid, absent their life, the ultimate price. They lost their property, they lost their position, they lost their elite status in society, right. They lost their political rights, they had to go live in exile. And so they understood what it meant to rise up, but they also understood the benefits, because ultimately Mexican independence was achieved and they had a restoration. And so, they had it, so in other words, they weren't the first, it wasn't their first rodeo. And they had put it all on the line before. And I think having gone through that experience and yet to see the same thing essentially happen again, to see right. tyrannies take hold, to see a liberal tradition tossed out and an illegitimate, from their perspective, an illegitimate government step into place. Ruiz writes home the day after Stephen F. Austin dies. They're in between sessions of the Texas Congress, and he writes home a letter. I know it as the letter from Colombia, and he writes to his son-in-law Blasareta back home, and he says, don't side with the Mexicans when they return. They fully well knew Mexico was not going to let what happened lie. They were going to return. And he makes this interesting observation. He says, we cast our lot with the Americans because they are freedom-loving people and they have the arms to defend it. And so I think this idea of rebellion, but not, but being able to defend it through military arms was very important to them as well. And so having the political aspirations that they did, wanting to see a restoration of federalism and Mexican liberalism, seeing that not being a political reality or possibility, but seeing other neighbors, whatever, where they could find common cause, who had a military tradition, had arms, had connections in the United States, where they could fund a revolution, hold it. I think they saw an opportunity to finally achieve that freedom. Now, what's interesting, and it has to be conjectured, is Ruiz didn't live long enough to go through the experience of annexation to the United States, so you can't really say right. what he would have thought. Right. But his son, Francisco Antonio, was vehemently opposed to American annexation, and he would often write in the Tejanos newspaper, polemics, saying things such as, distant government in Mexico City was bad. How, why would we think distant government in Washington D.C. be any different? Or arguing that only those who participated in the revolution should have a vote, not this wave of immigration that came in. So I would tend to think that his father would share those similar views, which is what he's trying to achieve is political independence for Texas, for his local community, and to cast off this bad distant government. And right. He probably would have been opposed to American annexation for the same reason.
Right. I think we maybe have a little bit of time. I did want you to read so there's a couple paragraphs that I really like toward the end of your book. It's the bottom of page 179, and then that's where the paragraph, the first paragraph starts, and then it goes into that second paragraph, or the second paragraph on page 180. I really think is a great kind of, it's just perfect.
Okay. Well, great. I'd be happy to read it.
Okay.
So yeah, page 179, the book on the bottom of the page.
And
Ruiz's
so,
true legacy.
right,
Okay.
because before that you're talking, he's passed away, and you're talking about what he left to whom and what's left and how much he's worth and stuff. So that's, yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yes. We get to count his estate. Yes. So then the book continues. Ruiz's true legacy did not lie in the trappings of his estate, but in the leadership he exhibited during his lifetime, and the model he became for other Tejanos in Texas. He was a product of the Texas frontier. He lived his entire life in a physical and cultural borderland, operating within Tejano, Mexican, Spanish, American, and Native American cultures, and ever-changing political boundaries. His political worldview was shaped by Iberian jurisprudence, the Jesuit Enlightenment, Mexican liberalism, Native American traditions, and the American experience with democracy. His unique cultural experience growing up in Béxar ingrained in him the value of physical security, a distrust of distant governments, and the ability to see beyond cultural divisions. Ruiz's life and importance in Texas history cannot be understood fully unless examined from within the Tejano experience. His support of Texas's independence had more in common with Mexican federalists than his American counterparts. His support for the Texas uprising of 1836 was not the political or intellectual child of American political thought or aspirations, but instead was deeply rooted in the tradition of Hispanic provincialism, Spanish-Mexican liberalism, his revolutionary experience, and the frontier influence in Texas. He did not think in terms of manifest destiny, white supremacy, or American political thought. In the decades prior to Texas's independence, Tejanos engaged in a fiery struggle to define their place in the far northern frontier of the Mexican Republic in light of the numerous questions left unresolved when independence from Spain was achieved in 1821. Within this early Mexican dialectic on national identity, Ruiz's political views diverged from the strong tendency towards metropolitanism and the dominance of Mexico City over the nation. His political and revolutionary careers revealed a distinctly provincial outlook rooted in the culture and experiences of early Tejanos. Ultimately, the divergent view of national politics resulted in his support of independence from Mexico and participation in the establishment of the Republic of Texas.
Awesome. That's great. I love that. So we have a couple questions, and they're kind of hard for me to see, but I'm just trying. Let me, I think I can see them. So there's one that I can see right here is from Francis Galan. It says, hello, Art, great job on your book. I noticed on your map in the chapter on Ruiz in the neutral ground during his exile that he stayed at his brother's Rancho Santa Barbara, Rio Ondo. It appears to be located precisely where the former Spanish fort and mission of Los Ades was situated, south of Bayou Pierre. Did you see this ranch mentioned in connection with Los Ades, Francis Galan?
Yes, actually, because it's a 640-acre grant, and it was granted to his brother Antonio Ruiz, who was a presidio soldier, and he was stationed at La Nana and Nadayes in that area. So that's where it originated. So it doesn't overlap the location of Los Adayes, okay, but it's in the backyard over there. And so, what's interesting is that Bayou Santa Barbara is no longer a topographical name. So Rio Ondo is, and so that was one of the, probably took us a day to figure that out with the local GIS person at the county or the parish they have there in Louisiana. And we located it finally through deed records as it's now an unnamed bayou. It kind of has a wide configuration, and so
the bayou with no name.
Yes, there you go, the bayou with no name. But But anyway, that's kind of its association with Los Adayas, is that it was originated as a grant from a Presidio soldier, and so it would have been in proximity to the Presidio.
Awesome. So and another person has asked, although I don't see a name, I think the last name is Rojas, but I can't tell who. Who is it? Norma? That's my sister. So what was the name? What were the name of his parents, and where were they raised?
So his father was Juan Manuel Ruiz, and he's from a town called San Luis de la Paz. In the records, it's Querétaro. In the modern political geography, it's Guanajuato. And his mother is Manuela de la Peña, and she is from Saltillo. And we don't have a record of where they met or married, but we do know that the Ruiz family immigrated approximately at the same time that Escandón was recruiting people from the same place, Querétaro, to populate the northern frontier. And so, again, I wasn't able to find them in Escandón's records, and of course, they went a little bit further. They ended up in Béjar. But we know from the last, church, baptism record of the family, and then the subsequent one, that it was within a year or two of Escandón's recruiting people in Querétaro to move north.
Okay. Okay. Can you see the asker, the name of the asker for the next question? No? Raul Munoz. I think he's a professor, right? I believe he's a professor. He says, can Professor Martinez de Vara offer some comments on Ruiz's views on slavery and the Tejano view on the subject in general? Right. And we have just a couple minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah. So
make it quick. Yeah.
I was unable to find any record that Ruiz owned slaves. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't appear to be a slave owner. He did, however, we know that when he was stationed at Fort Tenochtitlan, he would return fugitive slaves to Austin's colony. He was a big proponent of Anglo immigration based upon the cotton economy. And so in his various correspondences, we know that he was in support of land grants and would have supported probably the Tejano workaround of lifetime indentured servitudes, mm-hmm. But he did not seem to engage in the activity directly. But he also wasn't a big opponent or proponent. But I think within the context of his age, he definitely participated. Overall, I think it's a very complex situation because there is a Spanish tradition of slavery or forced labor. There's an indigenous system tradition of forced labor, and they vary in degree and in differences, circumstance with Anglo-American slavery, and they're not 100% analogous. Mm-hmm. But I think the idea of forced labor was ingrained in the colonial culture to various degrees. And we saw Ruiz's father, for example, adopting an indigenous child, which was in essence a form of forced labor. And so they would not have had contemporary views of slavery or opposition to slavery. And so, but slaves in Spanish and society had very different, had different rights than you would see in chattel slavery in America. I mean, you see them being baptized, you see slaves and non-slaves being married. Right. That also occurred in Anglo-American slavery, but it's a different form of forced labor, but probably not one anyone would want to participate.
Okay, you're right. Okay, and I just have a comment, and that comes from Jerry Geyer, who is on the board of the Friends of Casa Navarro, and he says, "Great job. We should do this as often as practical." So, and that's a good idea. So, if you've got something else to add, this has been great. I really enjoyed this. It wasn't as painful as I thought it was going to be. So, and maybe next time we'll be a little not quite so creaky with this, but do you have anything that you would want to add to this?
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I'm considering our pandemic.
Buy my book, right?
It's been a little bit different. I've had other books released, and you get to go out and
I know. Yeah.
interpersonal interaction with folks, and
Sure.
this one's been very different.
Yeah.
And so this is the first opportunity I've been able to speak to it to any kind of an audience.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yes,
Well,
I mean,
we had up to 55 people log in, so this is great. We had about 70 people register, but about 50 of them showed, which is actually really good. I've got 53 on right now. And I think my daughter finally got offline, so she was one of them. She was sending me weird messages too.
So I think it's a
So
great
anyway,
format. I think it would also be interesting to have other
yeah,
experts, Dr.
yes,
Galan, and folks get on
yeah,
there
yeah,
and
yeah.
talk about our various expertises or
Yes.
areas
Yeah,
of study
absolutely. Thank you for
more
that suggestion.
deeper. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, thank you for inviting me. For sure.
Yeah. So we have a few more webinars scheduled in the near future. At noon on Thursday, August 13th, join Casa Navarro's educator, Kristen Hernandez, for a webinar on the impact of corn on the culture of San Antonio. And you're going to be surprised really at how fascinating this is. Kristen is going to be joined by 2 NPS park rangers from the San Antonio missions. And so I really think that you'll find it interesting. As well on Thursday, August 27th, and that's at 6 in the evening. I'll be talking to Severo Perez, and he is a San Antonio native. He lives out in California now. He's the author of Odd Birds. It's a delightful novel set in 1961 San Antonio, and I just read it, and it was really cool, very good. Severo is also, we're going to talk about this with him a little bit too. He's also the director and screenwriter of the film. It's called And the Earth Did Not Devour Him, and it is the film adaptation of the Tomás Rivera novel called Y no se lo tragó la tierra. And it's about a family of migrant workers who travel from, back and forth between the Valley of Texas and I think they go to Michigan, or it's up north somewhere. So we're going to talk a bit about his experience turning that novel into a really amazing film, and I can't recommend that film anymore. I mean, it's a great film. So, thank you, Art Martinez de Vara, for sharing your time with us this evening. Your book is a wonderful and very necessary addition to the canon of Texas history, of Tejano history, actually. So, we're going to sign off. And from Casa Navarro State Historic Site in downtown San Antonio, have a good evening. Bye, Art. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.